There are few sci-fi series that are as simultaneously as richly imaginative, densely detailed, and just as out of their goddamn minds as Dune, which began with the novel Dune, published by Frank Herbert in 1965. And indeed, when I say it's popular, I'm not kidding. 20 million copies of the first novel in print, by some estimates, the single most popular sci-fi novel in all of history. From there, Herbert went on to produce another 5 sequel novels. His son, with co-author Kevin Anderson, added another dozen to the mix. It was adapted into a movie by David Lynch in 1984, remade into a Sci-Fi Channel TV miniseries in the year 2000, and of course, most recently, filmmaker Denis Villeneuve made a new movie version in 2021. Obviously, a lot of people have weighed in with their interpretations of this series and its universe. So why do we need another video on this? I think one thing that is less appreciated than it might be is the amount of actual real-life history that Herbert used as inspiration for these books. As a lifelong sci-fi nerd, as well as a historian, I figure I'm kind of in a pretty good position to comment on some of that. Because ultimately, I think examining the sources that an author uses as fuel for their forges of imagination enhances my appreciation of their creativity and genius. If peeling back the curtain in that way doesn't really sound like your thing, like maybe it'll ruin it for you or something like that, maybe you should go find a cat video to watch.
We brought you a little cat, Thufa. You must care for it if you wish to live.
Should go without saying, blanket spoiler warning for all of the books and movies. All right, let's do it. Greetings, I'm Dr. Doug Campbell. Now, my first experience with the Dune universe came with David Lynch's movie, which I saw in the theater at the age of 9 years old. Is this a good adaptation of the book? Not really, but it is totally unique, deeply beautiful, profoundly bizarre. I love it passionately, and the fact that I saw it at such a young age probably explains more than a little of the sort of weirdo that I am.
You knew the spice would change me. But thanks to your teachings, it's changing my consciousness. I see it. I can see it.
And really, what else could the studio have possibly expected? Hiring the director of Eraserhead and Blue Velvet and expecting him to deliver the next Star Wars movie? We're all lucky that we got what we got. Just as one way in which this film is so bonkers and wonderful, the soundtrack, which I have on vinyl, is by Brian Eno, the pioneer of electronic music, on the one hand, but also by 1980s pop rock band Toto on the other. It's just so glorious, just like the entire movie. Weird, and in that sense, I think it is kind of true to the spirit of Herbert's book. Obviously, I did go on to read the novel. This is just one of the many copies I've owned over the years. I've read it many times. And from there, went on to some of its sequels, Dune Messiah, Children of Dune. I kind of tapped out with God Emperor of Dune. There was some interesting stuff there, but it seemed like too much of it was just a nigh-immortal human sandworm hybrid bloviating about politics and philosophy for dozens and dozens of pages on end. It was a little tedious. And I've read Marxist theory in German, so I've got a high threshold for tedious, but a bit much for even me. I have not read any of the sequels by Herbert's son or Kevin Anderson, so I won't comment on them here. Likewise, I did watch the sci-fi miniseries, which was faithful but unmemorable. I also loved Villeneuve's movie, which was in its own way as beautiful and weird as Lynch's version and as the novel itself, so I'm looking forward to what he does with the rest of the series.
My desert. My Arrakis. My Dune.
Just wanted to get all of that out of the way so you have some sense of where I'm coming from with all this. But enough about me. Let's talk about Dune and history. Okay, probably the most appropriate starting point should be the planet, which is the focal point of the series, Arrakis, also known as Dune. The reason why this desert world is so important is because it is the only source of the spice mélange, which is used by guild navigators to fold space, making it possible to travel the vast distances between worlds instantaneously, which is Herbert's own solution to the perennial sci-fi problem of how do we get human beings between planets since they're so damn far away. The spice is mined under the auspices of the Chom Company, which, if you care, stands for the Combine Honnête Ober Advancer Mercantile, or something like that. I really have no idea how Herbert intended that to be pronounced, but an enormous company. The company kind of oversees spice distribution, but the mining of the spice is done by one or the other of the great houses which has the planet Arrakis as their personal fief. And because it's so crucial for transit and commerce, without spice the galaxy would simply fall apart. And this, quite obviously, is simply an adapted version of the world in which we've all been living in for the past century and some change since the invention of the internal combustion engine. During this era, access to oil has been a necessary prerequisite for easy, rapid transportation and trade on planet Earth. And the question of who has access to petroleum reserves, who is able to control oil and profit from that, has been one of the major drivers of human history during the past couple of generations, has served as the inspiration for imperialist squabbles over zones of influence, and more than a few wars. The place where quite a bit of the world's oil supply comes from is the modern Middle East, the culture and religion of which happens to bear more than a little passing resemblance to that of the inhabitants of the world of Dune. Coincidence? The idea of an entity like Chom Company, which blends state power with private ownership and profit, that also certainly resembles some of the oil companies that have been chartered over the past 100 years. We could talk about the British Anglo-Persian Oil Company or the Iraq Petroleum Company, as well as Aramco, the Arabian-American oil company which was based in Saudi Arabia. For that matter, we could go back to the OG of joint stock corporations, the English East India Company, which for the better part of 300 years was always in the mix with anything the British Empire did in Asia. As allegories go, the spice oil thing is not exactly subtle, but one of the things that it really does do for the Dune series is give it something that a lot of sci-fi stories lack, which is a sense of economics. That rather than having various antagonists do things just because they're evil or whatever, like the Emperor in Star Wars, the whole spice thing allows readers to easily understand the motivations of the various characters and factions in the Dune universe in a very material way. It helps explain how Herbert's sci-fi universe works and the forces that drive it. In the universe of Dune, as in the real world, wealth equals power.
I will have Arrakis back for myself! He who controls the spice controls the universe!
One other interesting little quirk, though, is that in addition to being necessary for interstellar travel, the spice is also something that allows people to live far longer than their natural lifespan and is also a potent psychedelic. So you sort of have to imagine oil, but if you did lines of oil, you would live a long time and you would trip balls, which is admittedly kind of an interesting idea. Another real-life historical inspiration that is very much in the mix in Dune is the legacy of European feudalism. The notion of a kind of decentralized power structure in which various aristocratic houses compete with one another for power, wealth, and influence. That decentralized structure was obviously an inspiration for the power structure in Dune, which does feature an emperor, but also, like each of the great houses, has their own fiefs associated with different planets. And they have different noble titles. House Atreides is ruled by a duke. House Harkonnen is ruled by a baron. You've got other great houses in the Landsraad that can compete with one another, or which can join together to potentially overthrow an emperor.
The Emperor has spoken. House Atreides shall immediately take control of Arrakis and serve as its steward. Do you accept?
We are House Atreides. There is no call we do not answer. There is no faith that we betray. The Emperor asks us to bring peace to Arrakis. House Atreides accepts!
Atreides! 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 Atreides!
All of that very characteristic of European feudalism during the Middle Ages. Also, as an aside, was an inspiration for another great sci-fi series, Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, which isn't quite as widely read as Herbert's, but is in its own way just as great. I recommend you check it out. The power structure is not the only thing that is vaguely medieval about Dune. One of the other conceits is that the shields that are used for fortresses and ships and even people is driven by something called the Holtzman effect, which, if it interacts with lasers, produces a nuclear explosion. So this means they can't use lasers without annihilating themselves. Projectile weapons are more or less useless against the shields. So it sort of boils on down to a kind of honor culture that features a lot of man-to-man dueling and like knife fighting and stuff like that.
The slow blade penetrates the shield.
Guess I'm not in the mood today.
Not in the mood. Mood's a thing for cattle and love play, not fighting.
I'm sorry, Gurney.
Not sorry enough.
Which is also another problem that a lot of sci-fi has to deal with. Already by the time Herbert was writing in the 20th century, warfare had become very impersonal. Much more destructive, but you can't really look your enemy in the eyes, and that's not terribly exciting to read about in a book if you're just fighting by pushing a button. So this allows Herbert to bring it back down to kind of personalities and individuals and kind of dude against dude, especially with cool knives, some of which are made of sandworm teeth and stuff like that.
I will kill him!
So we've got 20th century competition for resources as an inspiration. We've got the values of medieval European feudalism. What else? As a brainy child of the 1960s, Herbert seems to have been very widely read and was inspired by an eclectic array of different philosophical and religious systems. Probably the most obvious inspiration for specifically planet Arrakis and the semi-nomadic Fremen who populate it is the Islamic world. A great deal of the terminology that the Fremen use is lifted more or less directly from Islamic history, starting with the title Lisan al-Ghaib, which Herbert translates as the voice from the outer world that describes Paul Atreides. That's actually a term that was applied to the 14th century Persian poet Hafez. The Fremen also refer to Paul as the Mahdi, which is a sort of messianic term in Shia Islam. Even the new name that he adopts, Muad'Dib, which on Arrakis refers to a desert mouse, is simply a sort of transliteration of the Arabic word for teacher. They talk about Paul and the Fremen unleashing a galactic jihad, the Arabic word for struggle, holy war essentially. The title that the emperor uses before he's overthrown by Paul Atreides is the Padishah Emperor, which was a Persian title. Like, we could go on and on with the Islamic inspiration. One thing that we might specifically zoom in on, Herbert read a 1960 book by author Leslie Blanch entitled The Sabers of Paradise, which dealt with a 19th century rebellion led by Imam Shahil in the region of Dagestan and Chechnya, in the Caucasus, the region between the Black and Caspian Seas. This rebellion against Tsarist Russia was ultimately unsuccessful, but it seemed to have provided the grist for much of Herbert's description of Fremen society as a culture of fierce warriors driven by blood feuds. Some of the terminology even that Herbert uses in the book, whether Canley to describe vendetta or the word siege, comes from this kind of Caucasus culture here.
I have here your answer from Duke Leto.
What does Leto say, fighter?
He wishes to inform you that vendetta, as he puts it using the ancient tongue, the art of Canley is still alive. He does not wish to meet or speak with you.
I made my peace gesture. The forms of Canley have been obeyed!
So there's the broader context of the Islamic world, but also the specific context of rebels in the Caucasus in the 19th century. All of this leaves Herbert open to charges of Orientalism, that he uses tropes of Islamic history and culture as just a bit of flavor, of spice, if you will, a kind of exoticized East to make his future societies seem more exotic, which is kind of a condescending way to use a great global culture. Now, for that matter, I mean, certainly I wouldn't be the first person to point out that, Paul Atreides is one in a whole series of quote-unquote white saviors along the lines of Lawrence of Arabia or Dances with Wolves or Avatar, where somebody from outside comes in and kind of plugs themselves into a different culture and proves themselves to be more adept than the people who were raised in that culture and kind of delivers them to salvation. That too is kind of condescending. Like, just because Herbert's books are brilliant doesn't mean that they are immune to any host of criticisms. In addition to that stuff, he takes from other religious traditions the term Kwisatz Haderach that he uses to describe the sort of superior being that the Bene Gesserit order is attempting to breed, that he translates as the shortening of the way, is a Hebrew term from the Talmud, referring to somebody who can accomplish instantaneous travel, which obviously that shows up in the book. Moreover, the Bene Gesserits themselves can be seen as kind of a female sci-fi analog to the Jesuits, a Catholic order that sought to advance the agenda of the church through education and advocacy. They also were sometimes portrayed as being kind of the focal point of shadowy conspiracy theories, which doesn't have any basis in fact, but fits pretty well with how Herbert portrays the Bene Gesserit sisterhood.
You were told to bear only daughters, but you in your pride thought you could produce the Kwisatz Haderach.
Was I wrong?
You're lucky he didn't die in that room. If he is the one, he has a long way to go. His sight is barely awakened, and now he goes into the fire. But our plans are measured in centuries. We have other prospects, if he fails his promise.
In terms of philosophy, plenty of people have highlighted the impact of Carl Jung or Sigmund Freud, Martin Heidegger, Zen Buddhism. One author that I would be surprised if Herbert hadn't read was Friedrich Nietzsche, that a great deal of how he portrays the unlocking of human potential seems to have a lot in common with Nietzsche's comments on the Übermensch, a kind of creative, elevated overman, I guess is the best translation for the German. Also, the whole doctrine of eternal recurrence seems to fit very nicely with the kind of eternal iterations of Duncan Idaho golas that are continually cloned in a vat and brought back to life until they're eventually killed by the God Emperor, sort of over and over and over again in a repeating cycle. And the figure of God Emperor Leto II perhaps gets us to one last historical resonance which we ought to talk about, which is to say, the intersection between Frank Herbert's politics and the politics of the world of Dune. Now, Herbert's parents were kind of old school lefties in the early 20th century United States. They were supporters of Eugene Debs. Herbert himself seems to have veered away from that, had a profound mistrust of bureaucracy, was something of a supporter of 1970s and 80s Republican figures, although always with an idiosyncratic individualistic twist. Like he liked Richard Nixon far more than John F. Kennedy, because Kennedy was exactly the sort of person that people tended to put up on a pedestal as a kind of heroic political savior figure that gave Herbert the willies. Well, he thought that Nixon was corrupt enough to reveal to people that they shouldn't trust the government, which is a take, I guess. And I think that does show that Herbert's politics can't be easily encapsulated. Like, I think one thing that is not sufficiently appreciated by a lot of people who read these books or watch these movies is that Paul Muad'Dib is not the good guy here. He, in his way, in unleashing a galactic jihad that claims millions of lives, is every bit as awful, is worse, in fact, than the Harkonnens or than Emperor Shaddam IV.
Somebody help me, please. It's coming. I see a holy war spreading across the universe like unquenchable fire. A warrior religion that waves the Atreides banner in my father's name. Fanatical legions worshipping at the shrine of my father's skull. A war in my name! Everyone shouting my name!
And certainly his son, who becomes an immortal god emperor, who reigns for thousands of years and crushes humanity. Well, I wanted to say his boot heel, but worms don't really have boots, do they? Under his slimy little wormy body. And he represents totalitarianism in his absolute purest form. And granted, he says that he is doing this following what he terms his golden path, because it's the only way to save humanity from eventual extinction because of stagnation, that he's going to sort of teach them a lesson that they'll never forget about never putting all of their faith in an absolute leader. But I mean, isn't that what totalitarians always say? That wielding all of this absolute power is for the greater good. Ultimately, however, I think in some ways, Paul Atreides and his son Leto II are the most historically minded characters in all of science fiction, though. Because of doing so much spice, they have the ability to see the future and sort of look at the outlines of history from the outside and look at the broader kind of cultural, genetic, economic, political forces that are bearing humanity along. And even with all their powers, in some ways, they are a prisoner of those forces. That, Herbert's vision of, even the most powerful entities being unable to do more than a little to nudge the direction of humanity one way or another, I think is a refutation of a sort of great man vision of history that holds that it's all in the hands of individuals. Herbert's science fiction universe is really one that does consider all of those forces that shape the choices that we make on a daily basis, and I think does a pretty good job of portraying them. Obviously, we could have talked about more. If there's anything that you feel like I've forgotten in terms of historical influences in Dune, feel free to leave me a comment. Hope you found this interesting. I enjoyed doing the video. They're a little bit different than the stuff I've done before, so maybe I'll do some more. If you can think of other sci-fi or fantasy franchises that would benefit from this sort of a treatment, do feel free to leave me a comment. That's all I got for you. See you later.